So let me start with Psalm 52. I often say this, but it's true. This is a distinctive psalm. It's distinctive in terms of, excuse me one second, Eric, please make me a host as well. It's distinctive in terms of, it's not, normally we think of Psalms as a conversation with God, but that's not the case here. This is David doing a monologue, not David,
No.
the it's of David. The psalmist is engaged in a monologue condemning a person of power who uses speech deceitfully and hurtfully. So it's all about a venting against a deceitful tongue, trusting in wealth. Also, distinctly, unlike some of the earlier Psalms, this psalm makes no reference to the damage caused by the deceitful tongue. It doesn't speak of the injury, which is often the context for the psalmist turning to God, expressing pain. This is, again, kind of a monologue and a pointing a finger saying, you think you got power because you're rich, because you got the control of the government, literally, because this is about Doeg. It's all going to come crashing down on you. So that's what this psalm's about. And I guard my tongue. So, and the contrast at the very end, where the psalmist will say, unlike Doeg, and I'll say a word about who Doeg is, because he, in this psalm, is the archetype of the one who misuses the tongue to cause damage before authority. So Doeg is here the context for the psalm. A little bit about who Doeg is. He appears in the first book of Samuel, chapters 21 and 22. I did make a mistake in my introduction saying it was 20 and 21. I went back to read this morning, saw that I had miswrote it. It's 21 and 22. So Doeg is a loyalist to King Saul. This is a phase of a young David's life where he is hated by King Saul. He's hated because King Saul hears that after the battle with Goliath, everybody is singing David's praises. And he sees David as a potential threat to his own authority. And so David is known as not only at this point part of the royal court, because he had played the harp as a young man, but he had married King Saul's daughter, Michal. So King David is widely known, but is also by many identified with the throne. David's on the run. He's out in the desert. He comes to a town called Nov. Nov is where at that moment the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is kept. Remember that tabernacle will only be brought to Jerusalem later when David is king. And so here in this priestly town, David arrives and he meets, before he even gets to town, a priest named Ahithophel. And David says to Ahithophel, I'm on a secret mission from the king. So don't tell anybody that we met. But I have some men here with me. We're all on a secret mission, and we need some food. And the king says, the only bread that we have is the bread from the offerings to God in the tabernacle that get changed every week. We can only give that bread to men who've had no relations with women. King David says, that's the case with my men. These soldiers have been very focused. They're pure. So the Ahithophel turns over bread from the loaves, those 12 loaves that were put out each week in the tabernacle. And then David says at the same time, and I also need a sword. So Ahithophel says, we have Goliath's sword. Goliath who you slew. So he knows who David is. He knows of that battle. And he presents to David Goliath's sword. And then David keeps moving. He leaves with his soldiers. Meanwhile, Doeg, who has been in Nov. Now that is interesting to know for commentaries later, because the commentaries, we don't know much about Doeg, whose name, by the way, means the one who worries. He's the worrier. But he's spending time with the priests. So for later rabbis, and I'll share with you some classic commentaries about who Doeg is, he's a scholar. He's going to the priests in order to learn their ways. We don't know if that's the case, but that's how the rabbis who are scholars imagine Doeg. And so Doeg is now back with Saul. And David will later admit that he saw Doeg when he was in Nov and will feel very guilty about it. Because the only survivor moving forward will be Ahithophel will have a son. Ahithophel is the priest who gave him the bread and the sword. And his son will find David later and tell him of a massacre. Because when Doeg tells Saul about all these gifts of bread and the sword, Saul says, well, they're traitors. Mind you, Ahithophel was told by David he was on a secret mission. There was no reason that Ahithophel and the priests of Nov, who were something like 54 priests, knew the nature of David being in their midst. But Saul says, go back and kill all those priests. They're traitors to me. And no less than Doeg himself will do the executions, and not just of the priests, but when he finishes with the priests, according to chapter 22 of first book of Samuel, he will then kill the townsfolk of Nov too. Meanwhile, David gets away. So in sum, it's a dramatic story in a young David's life, which you'll see in chapter 22, will lead to David continuing to be on the run and in danger, where he will feign madness before a neighboring king and escape again. So a very difficult phase of David as a young man's life. And this psalm, like the other psalms we've seen, is not necessarily written by David, but it could have been. Modern scholars tend to see a lot of the inscription as being a prototype of a situation. I'm going to now post this psalm and then talk a little bit about its word plays and construction as we begin. I have a double title for contrast: A Deceitful Tongue Trusting in Wealth. And again, my titles, as I've grown to do them, are quotes that jump out at me from the psalm. But I am like a leafy olive tree in the house of God. So I begin Psalm 52. For the conductor, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. What is your praising of evil, powerful one? Kindness of El is continuous. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteously. Selah. You love all devouring words, a deceitful tongue. So God will shatter you forever, will break you and pluck you out of your tent and uproot you out from the land of the living. The righteous will see and fear. They will laugh at him. Behold, this is the man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in the abundance of his wealth and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But as for me, I am like a leafy olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the kindness of God forever and ever. I will give you thanks forever because you have acted, and I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of your devotees. So let me start from the beginning with just some commentary and then come back to how this is, resonates or is meaningful for us. First, this for the conductor, a maskil is classically understood as a teaching. So seichel, like in Yiddish we say seichel, somebody who has good common sense. A maskil is an intellectual teaching. This is provided for the listener to teach something. And then the context, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Achimelech, which again is the archetype of somebody who is using the tongue to lead to the pain and suffering of others with authority, right? So Doeg goes to the king and creates this havoc. And so now beginning verse 3, the psalmist is speaking as if to that person who is the speaker of evil. And the word that will be repeated over and over is you. He's as if pointing a finger. What is your praising of evil? And the word titalel can be reflexive. So Richard Levy will translate it as, what is your praising yourself with evil? So it's the person who's self-glorifying, powerful one. And the word gibor, that's often used, a gibor, for mighty one. So it's like a hero or a warrior is a gibor. Here it's probably used mockingly, powerful one. You who think of yourself as a gibor, as a mighty one. Interestingly, and this again will be a trajectory, and that is you'll find in Psalm 45, verse 4, also this use of the word gibor. But the classic commentators, and the most common of those, as we've seen, is a man named Rabbi David Kimchi, Radak in the Middle Ages in Spain. He'll see Doeg as the fallen scholar. Remember that I gave the context of Doeg being that person with the priests? You who had the ability through learning, you misused what you knew. And in the Talmud, there'll actually be a reference to the downfall of Doeg in Sanhedrin 106b. And here's what his punishment is. 3 angels. He's going to forget all his learning. His soul will be burned, and his ashes will be scattered in all places of study. So again, it's kind of, the scholars are reading this through their own lens. That who is the evil one? A fellow scholar who misuses one's learning. Well, back to the text as it is. Your tongue, verse 4, devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. And again, this continuing use of words like deceitful, destruction, devise. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteously. And so, and it continues, and then a break. Selah is a musical break. But then it's like you catch your breath and he keeps pounding at the vile danger of the misuse of tongue. You love all devouring words, bala, words that swallow up, a deceitful tongue. And it's all about the mouth, right? That which is able to swallow, the tongue. 7. So now the punishment. God will shatter you forever, will break you and pluck you out of your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. And here poetically, there is omnotopia in terms of the emphasis on the word you. So listen to the Hebrew. Gam el yitatzcha lanetzach, yachtecha v'yisachadecha me'ha'ohel v'shereshcha. And the cha is you, and all these verbs of how God will punish you. And now verse 8, the righteous will see and fear, and they will laugh at him. Yischaku. Some translators, instead of using the word laugh, will say jeer at him. But I like the word laugh because it more normalizes it. And then they will say, these are the righteous who have seen the downfall of this ill speaker. Behold, this is the man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in the abundance of his wealth. Barov ash ro, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. And then the last two verses, this, by the way, verse 9 is the first time God's name appears in this psalm, which is in verse 9, God's stronghold, and it appears twice now in verse 10. But as for me, I'm like a leafy olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the kindness of God forever and ever. So in contrast to the evil person, I, who did not take God into account and therefore could do evil, I dwell in the house of God. I look to God. I trust in God. Now this image of like a leafy olive tree harkens back to Psalm 1, the very beginning of Psalms, right? Shatul al palge mayim. The righteous is like a plant next to flowing waters. Remarkably, here in verse 10, the plant, the olive tree, is planted at the holy place. Now, explicitly in the Torah, you cannot have a tree planted in that place of worship. That's because people were animists, pagans, who worshiped trees. And so in the Bible, which had a strong anti-pagan orientation, you could not even have trees planted. So this is metaphor. Why an olive tree? I was just sitting the other night at somebody's home, physically distanced, and they had an olive tree. And I had just studied Psalm 52, so I could say to them, an olive tree. An olive tree is distinctive. One, it's identified with Israel and the Middle East, but what's distinctive about it is it doesn't shed its leaves, so it's green all the time. Its roots are deep, which allows an olive tree, even when battered or severely damaged, an olive tree can continue to flourish. And it produces fruit, the olive. And so an olive tree becomes a symbol of endurance, of hardiness, and productivity. I am like a leafy olive tree in the house of God because I trust in the kindness of God. And here's something important to know, and that is that the opposite of ra, of evil, here in verse 5, you love evil more than good. And what's the opposite? Lying rather than speaking righteously, or if you will, justly. The word tzedek can be justice or righteousness. So the opposite of evil is justice, knowing there is right and wrong. And the last verse, as a result, I will give you And now there's this intimacy with God. It's the first time in this psalm that the psalmist is now addressing God, not pointing the finger at the evildoer. I will give you thanks forever because you have acted, and I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of your devotees. So 10 and 11 point to the temple, which again is after David. David, it's only his son who builds a temple. 10 and which again, for purposes of dating, points to something later. But this is perhaps even said in the midst of community, amongst the devotees, chasidecha. And those are the opening and closing words. So you'll see in verse 11, the last word, chasidecha, your devotees. But chesed means those who do kindness. And verse, there is at the beginning here, no, maybe I'm confusing it with the one yet to come. No, yeah, I am right. Verse 3.
Verse 3.
Which is the first verse, after the introduction. Chesed el kol hayom. Kindness of El, one of the names of God, is continuous. So kindness, by the way, some Bible scholars say is a symbol of justice. So it's the opposite of evil. God engages in chesed. How is kindness manifest? By justice. Specifically, in the Bible, chesed is often linked to covenant, to brit. And so God's way is the way of justice, the way of kindness in the context of covenant, of an agreed relationship. And so I'll pull this together. Psalm 52, I pulled out the phrases, a deceitful tongue trusting in wealth. We're not told in the Bible that Doeg was particularly wealthy as such, but that is the phrase here, in verse 9. He trusted in the abundance of his wealth. Clearly, Doeg had influence and perhaps affluence in that he had both access to the priests of Nov as well as access to the king. So he's not an ordinary guy who just overhears. He's clearly somebody who's important in his time. Once again, this psalm is not necessarily about Doeg per se. It could be about a maskil of David, a teaching from the life of David about this kind of situation. Doeg's archetype. So I read a lot of commentaries to prepare. That's why I don't remember by heart all these psalm references. It's from other research. But one of them, two of my commentators distinctly, Martin Cohen and Richard Levy, try and ask, how are these words meaningful to us? And Martin Cohen, who some of you may recall was the rabbi at Temple Eilat for many years, and Mission Viejo, who's now for many years been in Roslyn, Long Island, New York, congregation whose sanctuary seats 2,000. So Rabbi Cohen, who's prolific, he wrote a number of years ago a commentary to Psalms. I've made reference before. And he raises an interesting question. And the question is, to what degree should those who use their tongue like a sharp razor, who use their tongues deceitfully, be condemned? And should we want evil for them? He says yes. Again, this is written like 10 years ago. He writes that just as those who are righteous, we wish them to be rewarded and blessed, those who are deceitful, we should wish harm for them. And again, that's something to ponder. This Psalm 52 is clearly the pointing of the finger, you, at who take satisfaction in devising destruction with your tongue for others, may you be punished. May people laugh at your fall later. So with that, your reactions or questions about Psalm 52, a deceitful tongue. Let me take this off the screen. One moment.
What did Richard Levy have to say?
Richard Levy, he basically said, one second, let me just put us, let me stop the share so that I can see everybody. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, now I can see you. Okay, good. So Richard Levy says, again, he's trying to personalize meaning. He says the challenge to each reader is to know the power and use of words and to use them accordingly for justice. So he's kind of broader in doing so. And I will point out Proverbs 18:21, which says, Mavet v'chayim biyad lashon. Death and life are in the hand of the tongue, or in the power of the tongue. So Richard Levy just sees this as that general expression. Pause to think about how we use our tongue. Martin Cohen has a little bit more edge and raises the question, here there is the wishing and the pointing of the finger that the bad person should later be laughed at after the downfall for the misuse of tongue. And he, Martin Cohen, says, and don't you think that's correct? If you see God as the judge and spirituality is asking for justice, then isn't there a place for that kind of condemnation in a real way? Julia?
I was interested in the image of the olive tree.
Yeah.
The philosopher Martha Nussbaum's amazing book, The Fragility of Goodness, begins with a very similar image from the Greek poet Pindar, comparing the virtuous person to a vine that's growing upwards. And the emphasis of the Pindar and then of Nussbaum's book is on all of the support that the vine needs in order to flourish. There's a kind of ecology of virtue that allows the vine to thrive. Now, I was wondering if you think there's a similar sense as he moves from being the olive tree and then trusting in the faithfulness of God, that to be that thriving tree, you don't do that on your own. That requires, a congregation. It requires a set of ways to be faithful. That faithfulness is not simply a kind of internal relationship, but it's something that that we're practicing as a group today. Or so I just wanted your thoughts about that.
Well, I love the sharing, both in terms of the literary reference, but even more the image and your phrase, the ecology of virtue. I love that, the quality of interdependence that is necessary for virtue to flourish. And, I did not think of that, but that may be where this trajectory goes, that Doag is an individual alone, reliant on his wealth as if he's self-sustained. And the trajectory of the psalm is into community. The last word of the psalm is your devotees, which is to say that he sees himself both supported, as you suggested, by others, and in the presence of both God, who is in the presence of others. And so for righteousness to flourish, it needs to be in the midst of those who are righteous. So in that sense, that's a trajectory that I didn't see in the commentaries here, and is lovely to see it. Yeah. A closing comment for today? Mimi, you have to unmute yourself. Let me unmute you.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mimi.
Yeah, I noticed that verse too. And before we started, the leafy olive tree
Yeah.
made me think of Hashkivenu. A canopy over us, protecting us.
Mm.
And but I haven't tied it into the rest of the psalm and Julia's wonderful teaching just now. And then the sustenance also from the olive tree, which you have addressed.
Well, there is that sense of the other aspects of olive tree that you point to, Mimi, and that is the olive tree provides shade and comfort to others and a sense of belonging. Tom Friedman wrote a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree about globalization years ago. And he used the olive tree as the symbol there of that which is a stake, literally a stake of belonging, because the olive tree lives for up to 100 years and has that quality of endurance and providing a sense of that's mine, my land, my tree. One last comment that you triggered for me, Mimi, and that is my last comment, and that's verse 11. In regard to prayers, you mentioned Hashkivenu. In our Amida, there is a paragraph called Modima Nachnu Lach. It's toward the end, and we say, we are grateful to you. And verse 11, the last verse, commentators point as the source of that closing bow in the Amida. I will give thanks to you forever because you have acted. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of your devotees. And so to pull Psalm 52 together, it is a distinctive psalm in terms of it's not a psalm as a conversation with God. It's not a psalm that describes one's own suffering as such. Rather, it's a pointing of finger at that kind of archetype person who misuses a tongue to hurt others as if that person is self-contained and can get away with it. And ultimately, where the psalm leads is to being in community, feeling the ecology of virtue that come with standing before God. With that, we conclude with the recitation of the Amida for any who need or would like to honor a loved one. Traditionally, in our tradition, we honor a loved one through study, and Kaddish is a prayer that acknowledges goodness in the world. And so if there are those observing a yurtzeit or in mourning, I invite you to join with me. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach le'olam olmei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei de Kudsha Barichu Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata damiran bialma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael V'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Thank you for coming together for Psalm 52. Psalm 53, remarkably, is a repeat of Psalm 14, which we've already studied, with just a handful of words changed. And that raises the question, why is it getting repeated? And what are those words that are changed signify? So it's unusual in that regard, and it's short. It's a very short psalm. It's only seven verses. So I look forward to being with you tomorrow also at 9 o'clock. Have a good day.
you.
Thanks for starting the day with us.